Hi, I'm Dr. Kelly Kessler, and I am the host of the podcast, Rewiring Health. This podcast is devoted to giving you expert information around nervous system regulation, subconscious mind reprogramming, and a variety of health topics so that you can optimize your life. Stop feeling burnt out, overwhelmed, in pain, and start living your life where you can remain successful without compromising your health. Decisions can often be a source of stress and anxiety, especially when it comes to our health, careers, and relationships. We are told not to make emotional decisions. We are told to weigh the pros and cons. We are told to consider the consequences. And often, after all the considerations, we feel completely overwhelmed and paralyzed in making any decision at all. In this episode, Dr. Rishma Walji brings a unique perspective on how to cultivate self-awareness, understand your emotions, trust yourself, and make decisions. Dr. Rishma Walji is a trained naturopathic doctor and PhD. She spent over 20 years in clinical practice helping patients make big decisions about health, hormones, and family. She currently is writing a book about intentional decision making. A lot of her work is related to awareness of emotion that can either guide or mislead our life choices. She is the host of the EXO Conversations podcast and a TEDx speaker. It was an absolute pleasure having her on the podcast, and I know you will truly enjoy this episode and feel more empowered to make decisions in your life. If you've connected this episode and want to work with me further, you can get on the waitlist for my Revitalize program, where you learn to create new energy, new success, and a new life. Stop letting stress impact your health by learning how to regulate your nervous system, and stop letting your limiting beliefs impact your success by reprogramming your subconscious mind. Grab the link in the show notes below. All right, welcome back to another episode of Rewiring Health. Very excited to be joined by Dr. Rishma Walji. So thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's really lovely to be here.
Yes. And so what drew me to you, and we just talked, is I watched your TED talk, and it was just, I was just saying, how much I connected with you and just your vulnerability and just your sharing your story and your journey. And do you mind sharing a little bit about that and what brought you to doing what you're doing today?
Yeah, for sure. And thank you. That means so much to me. I was telling you before that it was such a vulnerable and scary experience, not the speaking part, but the sharing of my personal story. Or at least part of my story. So thank you for that. How did I get here? When I was young, I was sort of, not very healthy. I had a lot of health problems. My family had a lot of health problems. We had a lot of loss. I have a very big family, very blessed to have a very big family, but also had a lot of people to lose. And so I went through loss very, very early. My grandparents lived with us. They died when I was younger. There was all these things that happened. And so from a very early age, I was really, really set on sort of changing the face of healthcare, so to speak. And I wanted to help myself. I wanted to help others. I wanted to help my family. And so I got into healthcare, spent a couple of decades in naturopathic medicine and academia. And mostly at the time I was doing hormones and fertility. And although I love that field and I really feel passionate about it, I think what drew me to it was less so the hormones and fertility and more so the empowering of people, because I was very strongly connected to giving people a voice when they didn't have one. Maybe it's because my parents were immigrants. Maybe it's because I'm a person of color. I don't know, but there was something in me, a woman, there's something in me that just felt like people need to have an empowerment of voices. And I had knowledge and skills that could give them that. And so sort of like to bring myself to today, after being in healthcare for, so many years and trying to work through the healthcare system and help people through their questions and issues with hormones and fertility, what I realized was there was another way that I could empower people. And that was with help decision making, because when they were coming to me with questions about fertility and hormones, there was a link, right? Sort of a thread that kind of went through it. And I realized that over the years, I was helping people less. I mean, I was treating people, of course, right? Like I was helping them with their hormones and treating them. But a lot of what I did was helping them decide between different courses of action. And some of it was health related. Some of it was relationship related. Some of it was personal related. Some of it was emotional, right? And so I realized that there's all this huge gap in life generally where we don't have either the information, the resources, the ability to manage what we're going through grief and all of these types of things, where it really influences our ability to make decisions that feel aligned, ones that we feel comfortable with, ones that we're not going to regret in the future. And so I got really passionate and curious about personal growth and decision making, and that's sort of where I'm at now.
Yeah, I love that. And it's so relatable because if you whenever you think of something in your life and you're in that in between of like, do I, don't I, that's the most anxiety provoking time versus like you just make the decision and you go with it. Now you can start handling that. But like when you're in that in between of what you should do, that's the worst part. And decision making is such a tough thing because of like, lack of information, lack of trust in many things, and so much that goes into it that I think many people struggle with that. And
Yeah, for sure. And it's personal too. We're like, I don't always know
yeah,
what the right decision is. And
right.
I'm working through it for myself too. But I feel like I have the tools, or at least I'm working through the tools because of my healthcare background,
Yeah.
that help me. And then people would ask me those questions. So being able to share is it's really wonderful.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I just love how you talk about the empowering because that is such a huge part, especially in healthcare where you need to be your own advocate. You need to know you're making an informed decision and just understanding like that you can be your biggest advocate in the process. And so I just love that. And I love how you've transitioned from that aspect of it to really diving into the empowerment of women and people in decisions. And so with like decision making in your experience, what have you found to be the biggest barriers for people when they make decisions, and why it's so hard to make decisions for people?
Oh my gosh, so many things. Okay, so let me start sort of at the beginning and why
Yeah.
I found this so interesting. Most people don't realize that most of our decisions are made, what I'm going to say, made for us, but really it's subconsciously. Like we make our decisions without even realizing. So even if you look at the research, we'll make a determination on a person when we see them before we've even come in contact with them. We have these biases, we have these past experiences. We have other people's voices in our heads, your parents or your coworkers telling you things before you've even had a chance to be exposed to something. And in a way, it's good, right? Like we need to have those things because we can't make every decision consciously. It's just too much for the human brain to be able to do. So we have these patterns, these habits, these subconscious things that happen in our brains to make us more efficient, to make us able to interact in the world. But I think what we don't realize is when most people talk about being intentional with their decision making, usually they say, well, yes, I was intentional. I thought about this decision.
Yeah.
And yes, we need to think about the decision. That's true. But I think what people don't realize is there is so much underneath that thinking that we haven't necessarily unpacked. And so thinking about the decision is one part of it, but there's so much more underneath that we need to be aware of, or we need to understand goes into that decision. So I think that's the piece that is the most tricky, the most challenging, but also the most important to know, like what is influencing that decision. And if we want to make a change in life, have you ever had this experience where you're doing something and you're like, oh, I need to change it. And then you just keep doing the same thing over and over. And 10 years later, you're like, I still have this problem that I identified 10 years ago, right?
Mhm.
It's like we know there's something there, but the reason it doesn't change is because we're not necessarily addressing all the other things that
Mhm.
happen in that reaction.
Yeah, yeah, and it's so that awareness is everything. And like once you become aware of that, that's huge because it is. We all gotten stuck in those patterns where like, oh my gosh, it's like a repeated cycle, and you think that like life just keeps happening to you, but until you realize that it's deeper things that are causing you to have this repeated experience, it's game changer. And with the things that are going underneath the subconscious, I know many people, and I myself included, like you struggle between making those emotional decisions versus like those cognitively logical based decisions. How do you help someone with that process of like, okay, how much do I trust my emotions versus like how much do I trust what I know?
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you brought up this question because everything I hear is don't make a decision based on emotion, have to be
Mhm.
logical. And
Yeah.
on one hand, I understand it, right? You don't want to make a decision in the heat of the moment. And then afterwards, when you calm down, you're like, oh, shoot, I wish I made a different
Mhm.
decision. So I understand the fact that we need to be logical. But in my perspective, like there are so many decisions that are emotional. Like you can't separate your emotion from a parenting decision, from a decision about where to move. There's so many emotions that are tied up into the things we do or the things we want. And so you can't actually separate those emotions. So I think there's some value in recognizing that you don't want to make a decision in a rush because you're having an emotion. And particularly if something's happened to you or you're having a bad day or something like that, of course, you don't want to make a big decision in that moment. But I think the tricky part is actually recognizing the emotion and then addressing that emotion separately. So I'll give you an example from my practice. When I would have fertility patients, for example, right? They would have to it's a really tough thing to be going through because, you try to get pregnant and then it doesn't work out, or you have a loss or something, and then you're just into the next one. And there's no time to really process your emotions. There's no time to grieve because you're sort of racing against the clock, right? And so part of the decision-making process, I think, is to separate the emotion and also deal with it. So I think that's the piece that people forget is maybe you don't want to make a decision in the heat of the emotion, but you can't ignore your emotion too. So addressing the emotion separately, or at least recognizing it, acknowledging it. So with my patients, for example, I would say like, having a miscarriage is a loss. It's like the loss of a family member. It's just that people might not know that you've gone through it. You still have to take time to grieve. You still have to take time to understand that emotion, even if you have to make a decision medically that is, more urgent, where you're like, okay, I need to try again. There is two separate things that are happening here, and we have to make room for both of those. So I feel like the emotions end up getting ignored, but really they need to be addressed. Even if you're just moving, even if it's not a super emotionally charged event, I'm moving to a new city, there's emotion to that, right?
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up because my experience on people I've worked with too is I've seen that it's like where people think they have to almost suppress the emotions because so many people hear that like don't make emotionally based decisions, and so you get into that like you feel stuck or like I feel this certain way, but let me numb it and just keep moving forward, and then it becomes this vicious cycle of like you have so many suppressed emotions, you feel a certain way, and then it doesn't work. So I
Yeah.
love
And
your
even if you think
approach.
about regret, right? Like if you're the type of person who lives in the future or in the past, like many of us do, and it's hard to stay in the present, if you're the type of person who is going to be worried about something in the future or regretful of something in the past, not dealing with an emotion is going to make you regret a decision more. It's going to make you anxious about the next decision more, right? So addressing that emotion and taking into account, sometimes what I usually say is with decisions, we always have to trade something, right? Like you have to give and take. You can't always have every single thing. Either option, there's going to be pros and cons. And so we have to also weigh, how much is this emotional decision important, for this emotion in the decision important to me? And if it's really important for me, let's say to be closer to my family and I have to pick up and move, if that emotion is really important to me, then maybe I have to sacrifice something else. Maybe I'm going to get a smaller place. Maybe I'm going to have to pay more for my place. And so it has to still weigh into the decision process because that emotion is significant. And if I don't move closer to my family, then that's going to weigh on me in the future when I'm looking back on my decisions,
Yeah, such a healthier way of looking at it and just honoring those emotions and recognizing it is part of the process. And yeah, I love that approach. And it's just so much more relatable and like, cause that's real. And it's like when we sometimes suppress them for so long, it's that like dissociation where you don't know how to go about things. And I truly believe emotions are there to help direct us in life.
Yeah,
For
absolutely.
someone who maybe has suppressed emotions for so long and they don't even know how to even read their emotions, that can be really tough. Like, how do you recommend someone to start to learn how to trust their emotions? Like, because I know some people feel a certain way and then be like, no, that can't be right. That's just like, my brain's playing tricks on me. But like, how do you start to learn how to trust those emotions and go with them when you haven't done it for so long?
Yeah, this is such a good question. I wish there was an easy answer, but I always go deep. Everyone knows that like I'm not a superficial answer type of
Love
person.
it.
But I'm going to give you the
Yeah.
details and then people
Yeah.
need to kind of work through it.
Mhm.
First of all, recognizing that it's not going to be easy, but
Mhm.
it's going to be worth it.
Yeah.
Like sometimes we have to wade through the pain. We have to wade through the discomfort. We have to wade through, some fears or even judgment, like self-judgment, right? Like sometimes if I get angry, that's an emotion for me that happens and I judge myself for it, right? Like, why did I get angry?
Yeah.
Especially in, let's say, a parenting situation, right? I'm like, oh, it's my kid. They don't know any better. Why am I? And it's not an emotion I feel very comfortable with. But if I sort of face it and think about like, oh, what is this anger? At least in my experience, it's kind of cluing me into a worry, usually. So if
Mhm.
I sit with it, like if I just get angry and judge myself, then I'll kind of go down this like, rabbit hole of being hard on myself. And we all know that's not good for me, right? Where if I look at it and I say, okay, why am I angry? What is happening? Is it really my daughter? Is it really me? What's happening? And I sort of get curious about what the emotion is without judging it, which is much easier to say and hard to do. But then typically it'll say something to me like, oh, actually, I'm really worried and
Yeah.
she's not listening to me. And I've told her not to go out late at night and she wants to go out late at night. And I'm angry that she disobeyed me or whatever you want to call it. But really, it's that I'm worried about her
Mhm.
safety. Like it allows me to address the issue differently. It allows me to make different decisions on how I parent. It
Mhm.
allows me to have different reactions with her, right? So I think one thing is just to recognize the emotion in a curious way. Another thing is to look for patterns. So I write about this a lot because I think that it's not just emotions, it's also body. And I think your audience would recognize this too.
Mhm.
Sometimes our bodies give us clues and it tells us, hey, there's something wrong here. And we just don't know how to interpret those clues, right? If I have a headache, it's like, what does that mean? Did I not drink water? Is it my, did I not sleep? Did something else going on? So recognizing the patterns and the symptoms, and sometimes healthcare providers can help with that, especially if it's, body, or a therapist if it's emotion. But recognizing those patterns can really give you a clue because there's a signal, there's a language that your body is speaking or that your emotions are speaking that we just have to understand and interpret. And so I think trusting your emotions, trusting your body really comes with developing that communication and that relationship. And the way I used to describe it with my patients is my husband and I both speak English to each other, and we often miscommunicate,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And we often have to say,
Yeah.
that's not what I meant, right?
Mhm.
And we both speak the same language, but my
Yeah.
body is speaking a totally different language, right? And I
Mhm.
don't understand it all the time. So recognizing that, seeing the patterns, paying attention to when does this happen? When does it get worse? When does it get better? Like this is the
Yeah.
healthcare provider and me talking, but
Mhm.
it's really diagnostics and then understanding like what is happening here without judgment, without control, just like a dialogue.
Yeah. Oh, I love that example you gave to you and your husband talking, speaking English to each other, because so many people can relate to that. I feel like there's still miscommunications that happen, even if you speak the same language, you live together, you know each other well, things still happen. But yet I find that, like, and probably you find too, people almost expect like, well, I should know what my body's saying. I should know
Mhm.
what my brain is saying, but it's not that way. And so I love that you brought that in, because it just makes sense. Like, okay, don't go down on, don't come down on yourself for not understanding that, and right off the bat, and that it is developed communication through
Yeah.
yourself. And
And there's another piece to that too, just to give context to what I'm saying.
Mhm.
I think a lot of people interpret awareness as self-awareness, like, oh, I understand I'm more of an introvert, or I tend to be a perfectionist, or whatever, right? This is like a self-awareness, and it's
Mhm.
super important. We need that self-awareness. But
Mhm.
there's so much more to awareness that I think gets missed. So
Mhm.
one is self-awareness of your personality, your thoughts, your emotions. There's also a self-awareness of your subconscious thoughts and emotions, which are much harder because they're subconscious. We don't know
Yeah.
what they are, but looking for them, recognizing them, being open and honest about them, right? Because I don't want to admit, oh, sometimes I get angry. Like that's
Mhm.
not something I want to admit, but it's true. It happens. And so if I look at it from an honest perspective, it allows me to make a change. Whereas if I just deny it and push it in the closet,
Mhm.
I can't do anything about it. It's never going to change, right?
Yeah.
The other
Mhm.
piece is in the self-awareness bucket, let's call it, is the body awareness. So
Mhm.
understanding, most of us don't pay attention to our periods or our sleep or our energy. We just drink a cup of coffee and we keep going, right? But recognizing these nuances and changes in our bodies, I think is really critical and part of the self-awareness. And
Mhm.
then there's two other pieces of awareness that I write about that I think are really important. And I've gone through several iterations of how to explain it. But one of them is what I call life awareness.
Mhm.
And most people don't talk about this, but it's really the awareness of how you relate to others.
Mhm.
So how are you in your relationship? How are you with your kids? How are you in social settings, right? There's a self-awareness, but there's also this relational awareness. How am I with them? How are they with me?
Mhm.
Right? Because it's just as important for me to understand my emotions as it is for me to understand my husband's emotions or my child's emotions. This is where empathy comes in. This is where, relationship building comes in. So there's what I call life awareness. And then the last one, which is really started off in healthcare, but I think applies to other contexts, is what I'm calling system awareness.
Mhm.
Just sort of a sneak peek into my book, because I haven't written about it yet, or I
Yeah.
haven't written about it publicly yet.
Yeah.
But it's system awareness, because a lot of times we don't know how stuff works.
Yeah.
So when someone comes into me and says,
Mhm.
I don't know what's going on with my body, maybe you don't understand the language your body's speaking, but you also don't know what's normal. I'd have people coming in and say, oh yeah, isn't it just normal that I bleed every time I have intercourse? And I'm like, well, no, actually, that's not. Let's talk about that. What's happening? What's going on in your body? Or they would say, oh, well, I get my period every 2 weeks. Isn't that normal? No, it's not normal. Let's talk about this, right? So sometimes we don't know how the body works. And in your context, I would imagine people don't understand the nervous system. They don't understand, how your body responds to certain things,
Right.
or how different parts of the body connect to each other. So it's physiology, anatomy, but then you can even say, like, finances. If I don't understand
Yeah.
how finances work, how can I make decisions about my bank account or my business, right?
Uh-huh.
So system awareness is how stuff works. And I think that's another piece that we really need to be paying attention to when we think about awareness.
Yeah. Oh, I love how you dive so deep into that. Because it is so true. I find it, yeah, you do get surfacey. And once you start looking at those pieces, and I love how you just integrate all the aspects of it and then talk about the interconnectedness, because they all do play on each other. If one aspect is really not functioning well, other things will start to suffer because of that. And if we're not even aware, like you said, like finances, if you want more money, but you don't even know how money works, like how do you change that? And also too, when you talk about, people coming in like, oh, bleeding during intercourse, and they don't even realize that that's not normal, but many things become normalized. And so we think, oh yeah, of course I should be stressed every single day and have a headache every day because this is just how it is. But yeah, it's like once you start diving into it and be like, do I need to live the rest of my life like this? And how can I change it? That's everything. And now you can start developing an action plan because you realize you actually need an action plan to change that. So
Yeah.
I love that. And I just love the different aspects. And I can't wait for you to come out your book, because that is just going to be so helpful to so many people to look at their life from a different perspective in that. Because
Thank you.
yeah, so I love those concepts.
And you're so right about things being
Mhm.
normalized. Like, we get so into our
Yeah.
habits and our patterns, we don't even realize that something's
Yeah.
wrong, right? We don't even realize,
Mhm.
like, oh, I get a headache every day for the past 6 years. Like, it's just my life.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
then what happens when you don't pay attention, or even if you pay attention and this happens and it's not right and it
Mhm.
shouldn't be happening, but you don't know what to do about it, what
Yeah.
happens is you lose hope and
Mhm.
you lose options. And then you stop trying, you stop asking, you just feel like this is your life. And in
Yeah.
some cases, people have things that they have to deal with for many, many years or the rest of their life. But in some cases, it's not true, or there's something that could give them relief. And I think that's important to realize, that if we lose hope, we lose our options.
Mhm. Oh my gosh, totally. Yeah. Yeah. Hope is that like energy behind it and just keeping you moving forward in a direction that's not stuck. Yeah. I
Yeah.
love that. And just as you were speaking before, there was like, just one thing that really stuck out to me is the difference in what you highlighted, is that like, the difference in saying what's wrong with me versus, what is this telling me? And it seems like such a subtle difference, but it's such a huge difference in the questions you ask yourself. Like when you ask what's wrong with me, you're going to get answers of what's wrong with you. But when you ask, what is this telling me? Now you can use that information. It becomes useful in moving you forward. So I just love that perspective that you shared, is looking at yourself differently and recognizing, like, if you're getting angry, instead of asking what's wrong with me, like, why am I doing this? What's the why behind this? And now you can start to dive deeper into the driving force. So
Yeah,
I
for
love
sure.
that.
It's the curiosity
Mhm.
that allows change, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I just want to dive more into like that subconscious, because I love this. And, I found the more I dive into my subconscious, the more I unravel things, but I found it to be really hard to start because you've lived, for years, decades with these thought processes that were developed in your childhood mostly. So how would you recommend, or, how have you done it to start to dive into some of those beliefs that we carry that we don't even realize we're carrying, that and that are dictating 95% of our life?
Yeah, for sure. And I think this is such an important thing. And I'm going to say it's a lifelong journey, because even me, every day, I'm realizing something that happened, in my past that is dictating how I handle today. And I
Mhm.
think especially for people who have gone through something in their past, like if they've gone through some traumatic experiences or they've had a health condition that's interfered with something, it really changes how you approach things in life. And even if you haven't gone through anything, what you think is a big deal, right? Like I would talk about, a baby that's been separated from their parent, like not to put guilt on parents, because I'm a parent too. And of course, I'm not going to be with my kid 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
But if that baby feels separation, then for that baby, there might be something there that sort of influences how they interact with their parents, how they interact with the world, right? So we all have these things that shape how we live, and they're necessary and they're important, and they help us get through something. But
Mhm.
over time, they may no longer be relevant. And so the first thing I think I mentioned is to look for patterns. That's the first thing, is to
Mhm.
recognize what is the subconscious thing that's happening,
Mhm.
because if you don't recognize it, you can't change it. And then the other piece is, how do we take action on that? And
Mhm.
a lot of it is reprogramming your mind, right? Like we have to reprogram how we think about things. And so the balance is, we can't think about everything all the time. So how do we bring to the surface what is subconscious that we want to change? And how do we push down the things that are conscious that maybe we want to change a habit and we want to push it down? And one of the examples, or one of the things that is helpful, is repetition. Nobody likes to hear this one, because it's like, I just want to learn it. I just want to
Yeah.
change
The
it.
quick fix, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the way I describe it is, imagine you're trying to cross a lake and there's a bridge, right? Somehow you formed this bridge to the other side, and it's in a certain way. So I'll give the example. It's one of the ones that I talked about on my podcast, like early on, when I was just sharing sort of what was going on in my own life before I started writing about all of this. And I remember I was really stressed out, and my husband was like, let's just go for a walk. Let's just go for a walk, get out of the house. Let's just calm down. And I was like, I don't want to go for a walk. It's cold outside. It's boring to walk around our neighborhood. Like and the bridge that I had created in my life, the stress bridge, was, I want to watch movies and eat chocolate. Like that was the bridge, right? Anytime I was stressed, I would watch movies and eat chocolate. Very unhealthy. And lucky for me, I went into naturopathic medicine and learned all about, healthy habits and things like that. But really, the reason I couldn't stick to some of them, or the reason I had a hard time and had to really practice over many years, was because I had this bridge that whenever I'm stressed, I watch a movie or I eat chocolate. And so we went out for walks and we just kept going. And we had a different purpose. It wasn't for stress management. It was because we wanted to get our steps. We wanted to get out of the house. We wanted to kind of have some time away from the kids. They're old enough to be at home alone for a little while. And over, I would say, the course of a year, maybe 2 years, we started walking very regularly, and we would just dump all of our emotions on each other. I would be like, I'm stressed about this. He would be like, I'm stressed about that. And we would just listen, talk, and the whole walk. And then we'd get back and we would feel better.
Mhm.
And I eventually created another bridge. So now when I'm stressed, I can choose to eat chocolate or watch movies, or I can choose to go for a walk. And I have now subconsciously realized that that walk is stress relieving for me.
Mhm.
And so I'm creating another bridge, but it takes a long time to create that bridge. It takes recognition, it takes time, it takes repetition, and it also takes understanding the connection between the walk and the stress, rather than just we're going to go for a walk to get our steps, right? It's this almost like subconscious reprogramming that I had to remind myself, oh, this actually makes me feel less stressed.
Mhm.
And so I'm going to do it in order to feel less stressed. It's like I was training myself the way I would train my kid, right? Like where I would say, you have to, exercise. I was kind of telling myself that because I wanted to create another bridge of stress management. Does that make sense?
Totally, absolutely. And the reward of it is meaningful enough to you that there was the desire behind it to keep going because you were gaining benefit from it. So
Yeah.
it makes total sense. But yeah, it's like when we're stressed, we go to what's familiar. So for you in the beginning, it was the, chocolate and watching TV. But when you become more familiar about something else, which became your walk, now it's like that stress, you go to what's familiar and it's a better habit that you're in as far as serving yourself. Yeah, makes total sense. And it's so true. It is that rewiring. It's like you gain these deep roots in what you know, and now you almost have to plant a new tree and get different roots and deepen those so that they are more solid of what you can go to. But yeah, I mean, I think the big thing you said is there's choice, and you always have a choice. And that's such an empowering thing, going back to empowerment, like what an empowering thing when every minute you have a choice. So even though some things may feel uncomfortable because it's a new habit, it's a new pattern, it doesn't mean that it's wrong. It just means that, like, how can we make a better choice? And asking yourself those questions is so important. So yeah, that's such a great example of
Yeah.
sharing that.
It does take time, and it does take really, conscious intention to be able to do that. I didn't start like that. That wasn't how I
Yeah.
started it. But
Yeah.
after I started realizing, I was like, okay, I want this to be my new thing.
Mhm.
But I want to mention something. You had told me a lot of people who listen to this podcast have gone through, a lot of physical changes or have had pain and that kind of thing. And I want to stress that when I talk about decisions, at least when I read about it or see it on social media, a lot of people talk about decisions in the context of productivity, efficiency,
Mhm.
determination, motivation. Like, you just have to get up and do it. You just have to be determined. And if you don't, if you're not, it's your fault, basically, is what they're saying. That maybe that's not the words that they're using, but that's what I hear a lot of
Yeah.
times. And I
Mhm.
really want to make this point that sometimes we have, this is another concept that I'm writing about in my book, and I call it decision constraints,
Mhm.
where sometimes we have a legitimate reason why we can't do it. So in my case, I was a caregiver for a long time for my kids. We have elderly parents, like all of these things. There's people that I was responsible for. So, you can tell me to get up at 5 a.m. and go for a run and do an hour of meditation, but I'm never going to do that, at least when my kids are young and when I have to check on my parents. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So a lot of that stuff that I was reading at the time, I would feel bad about it. I'm like, oh, I should just get up early, but I can't. And I think that also goes with other people who have other things, whether they've been through trauma, they have physical pain, chronic pain. There is a legitimate reason where you can't make a certain decision
Mhm.
that you feel like you should be making, right? The
Mhm.
proverbial
Yeah.
should,
Right.
right? And I think there is something powerful in recognizing that it's legitimate
Mhm.
and that you can't make the decision that you would maybe want to make, and maybe dealing with the grief of that and the change in your identity is important because that emotion piece is going to be there. But there's also another piece where, why don't we get creative about what you can do? And
Mhm.
why don't we have self-compassion for when we can't do what we think we want to do? How can we change that so that we can at least move forward? And maybe moving forward means I'm going to take a nap today
Mhm.
and I'm going to be
Yeah.
okay with that, right?
Oh,
So that's another piece where I feel like the empowerment is not just that you have to do what everyone tells you to do. What is right for you? And how can we be creative about how we change our subconscious thinking? Otherwise, we're just hard on ourselves. And
mhm.
I've done it. I've beat myself up so
Yeah.
many times, right? And it's not helpful.
Oh, such a great point to make. And thank you for bringing that up because it's so true. Everyone gets stuck. I think especially that, everyone's an expert now, it seems like. So you hear, like, I should be doing this. Oh, no, I should be doing this. And you can get bombarded so quickly. And then the guilt and shame of that does not serve you. So it's like you're trying to implement all these things. Either you're overwhelmed because you're trying to do it and you're actively doing it, or you're not doing any of them. And then you feel the guilt and shame of it. Or like, yeah, so you're just perpetuating the bad emotional cycle that you're already in, that you're trying to relieve yourself of. And it's such a great point to make because yeah, there's so many people that think they should be doing all these things, and it's not about how much you're doing and listening to every single thing that you're told. It's filtering it through what's right for you, and exactly what you said, doing what's right for you and recognizing that. And I'm sure, when you talk about your awareness, having all those awareness aspects to it and recognizing and knowing yourself has got to be a huge part in that, and being able to filter it appropriately.
Yeah, for sure. There's a huge difference between making a decision and making a decision that's right for you.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. That's huge. I mean, I was like, that's like if anyone's listening, like, whoever's listening is like, go rewind and listen to that again, because that is literally everything. And just knowing yourself well enough to know how you can move yourself forward and at what pace that is appropriate and at, what trajectory, whatever, like knowing that and not comparing yourself to other people, because really the drain of energy is comparison and criticism. And if we start going into those paths, it doesn't serve us in any way, shape, or form. So such a golden nugget there. I love that. So, so kind of moving forward, for someone who wanted to connect with you and reach out to you, how can they find you?
Yeah, my website is probably the best way,
Mhm.
livingxo.com. I am on socials, but it's not my favorite place to be. So the
Yeah.
website's probably the best. I have a lot of free resources too. I have a quiz that kind of plots people on the graph of awareness. And then the second piece of this graph that I didn't get to talk about is action. So kind of plots you on the graph and helps you figure out sort of where you are on the graph, and then gives you some steps to go afterwards, what to do next. To be more intentional in your life. I've got a gratitude challenge. I've got a workshop on emotional regulation, just all sorts of free resources. I try to just put as much
Yeah.
out there that helps people. And, I'd love to reach out, or I'd love anyone to reach out and just connect with me. That's sort of why I do this. It's the emotional currency of being able to connect with people. So yeah, my website would be the best place.
Awesome. And I'll put that in the show notes for anyone listening. Definitely check that out and connect. And thank you so much for everything today. There's just so many things that I know will resonate with so many people who are feeling stuck, struggling to understand their emotions, struggling to make decisions in their life, struggling to move forward. So many things you can take from this conversation and really apply them to your life and move forward. So I just appreciate all your insight and your experience and your sharing your journey.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. And thank you. And for anyone listening, please again subscribe to the podcast and leave any questions, comments, and please leave a review and let me know what you thought of this episode. And thank you again for being here.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for spending your precious time to listen to this episode of Rewiring Health. My mission is to inspire hope and healing through science-backed practices. If you found value in this, please share with 3 people and leave a review. By doing so, this message can be spread to those who need to hear it most. Also, to get updates on the most recent episodes, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for being part of this community, and I am forever grateful for you.